Hello and welcome. You are live with the New Mexico Department of Transportation. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual public information meeting along Cerrillos Road, hosted by the New Mexico Department of Transportation. We're excited to share information about the New Mexico 14 Cerrillos Road alignment study from St. Michael's Drive to St. Francis. Only our presenters today will appear on video. Community members are encouraged to participate live as we move into our Q&A session at the end of our presentation. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the NMDOT's project website following the event. That website is nm14cerrillos.nmdotprojects.org. Tonight, we are offering live Spanish translation during our event. Online participants can access the language channels in the interpretation function in your Zoom toolbar.
Estamos ofreciendo traducción al español en vivo durante el evento de hoy. Nuestros participantes en línea pueden acceder a los canales de idioma en la función Interpretación de la barra de herramientas de Zoom, al pie de la pantalla en el icono del globo terráqueo. Seleccione el idioma español y silencie el audio original. Se recomienda que elija el idioma que le gustaría escuchar ahora, incluso si ese idioma sea el inglés.
We recommend choosing the language you'd like to listen in now. You can choose between listening in English or Spanish, or toggle between both if you prefer. Again, please use the interpretation function on your Zoom toolbar to select the language you'd like to use to listen in tonight, even if that language is English. As we move into the Q&A portion at the end of our presentation, there are a few ways to participate live. If you are with us today via Zoom, you have two options during our Q&A. You can select the raise your hand function to be able to ask a question live, or you can type your question in the Q&A chat box down in your toolbar. If you are listening tonight on your telephone, you can press *9 on your telephone keypad to be able to ask a question live. We have a lot to share with you this evening, and you may want to get a piece of paper and pen to write down some of the information and ways in which you can participate. My name is Jennifer Heyer, Environmental Planner with WSP, and I will be facilitating your meeting on behalf of NMDOT. If you don't have immediate access to internet, continue to stay on the call line to hear our presentation. You can also request to receive a hard copy of tonight's presentation by emailing or calling me. My phone number is area code 505-878-6577. I can be reached at email at jennifer.hyre@wsp.com. At this time, I'd like to take just a minute to recognize our elected officials who are on the call this evening. On the call this evening, we have Tom Taylor, NMDOT Transportation Commissioner. Welcome, thank you for joining us. Also on the call this evening, we have Santa Fe City Councilor for District 4, Jamie Cassutt. Thank you for joining us. Again, on behalf of DOT, welcome to our event. My name is Jennifer Heyer with WSP, and I will be your facilitator throughout this interactive meeting. Next, I'd like to hand it over to John Romero to introduce you to our team members who are participating this evening. John?
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am John Romero, Highway Operations Division Director with the New Mexico Department of Transportation. The NMDOT has partnered with an engineering firm called WSP to conduct this preliminary engineering study on New Mexico 14 Cerrillos Road. I'd like to introduce the team that will be presenting this evening. You've already been introduced to Jennifer Heyer, our environmental planner with WSP. You will also hear from Paul Brasher, who is our NMDOT District 5 engineer, Manuel Maestas, our NMDOT North Region Design Manager, Javier Martinez, who is our NMDOT District 5 Assistant Engineer, and Terry Ward, our WSP Project Manager. Everyone I just introduced will be able to answer questions after our presentation, which should be about 45 minutes from now. In addition, I want to recognize the City of Santa Fe, who is partnering with the NMDOT to help develop this project. With that, I'll turn it back to Jennifer, please.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Next, I'm going to go over our agenda for this evening. Tonight, we're going to talk about the project limits and the project purpose and need. We're going to talk about the existing conditions and the project context. Next, we will talk a little bit about the NMDOT's project development process. Then we will talk about the preliminary alternatives, the comparative analysis and our key findings, followed by the schedule and next steps. We will end the meeting with a question and answer session, which will be about 45 minutes from now. Next, I'm going to talk about the project limits and provide some background about the project along Cerrillos Road. The NM14 Cerrillos Road study stretches approximately 1.6 miles from St. Michael's Drive to St. Francis Drive. The focus of the study is the Cerrillos roadway corridor itself, and the project does not include the St. Michael's or St. Francis intersections. It's just the roadway itself. This portion of Cerrillos between St. Michael's and St. Francis is the final segment of the Cerrillos Road reconstruction effort from Airport Road to St. Francis Drive. The NMDOT completed an environmental assessment of the whole corridor in 1998 for these improvements. Construction of the adjacent areas is complete, and we are now advancing with the final phase. The other segments were handed over to the City of Santa Fe, and similarly, NMDOT will hand off this segment of Cerrillos to the City of Santa Fe at the end of construction. For those of you who may have just joined, we want to welcome our participants on the phone as well as online. Thank you for joining us. If you don't have access to internet and would like to request a paper copy of our presentation, please feel free to call me at area code 505-878-6577. Also, if you just joined us online, please use the interpretation function in your Zoom toolbar to select the language you'd like to listen to in tonight's meeting. We have the option of Spanish and English. Feel free to choose one of those options now if you haven't already done so. That will help you have the best audio experience moving forward. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the project purpose and need. The purpose of the project is to address the deteriorating conditions along the corridor and look into those traffic operations and safety needs. The project is also needed to update the corridor in order to meet those current design standards today, as well as enhance American with Disabilities Act accommodations and address multimodal concerns. The existing 4-lane road divided highway as it is today will remain. We will also look at transit stops and multimodal access as part of the consideration. The project is needed to address a number of aging and outdated infrastructure concerns. These include pavement deterioration, sidewalk in poor condition, portions with no sidewalk, and portions of sidewalk that are not ADA compliant. There are sporadic bicycle facilities along the corridor. There are also traffic and safety concerns. The existing drainage has some problems, and there is also some flooding along the roadway, as well as closely spaced driveways and encroachments into the existing right-of-way. Next, I'd like to introduce Terry Ward, WSP Project Manager, who will summarize our review of existing conditions along this segment of Cerrillos Road and provide some project context. Terry?
Thanks, Jennifer, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by introducing a term called a typical section. So what is a typical section? It's a graphical representation of the roadway and streetscape elements of Cerrillos Road within the existing and or proposed right-of-way limits. This is important because we're going to feature alternatives of the typical section. And you can think of a typical section as if you were standing on the roadway and looking at the elements as they exist on the roadway. So here's the Cerrillos Road existing condition typical section. You'll see the right-of-way limits are 80 feet wide, and that's important because we'll talk about that several times tonight. The median is 12 feet wide existing. There's 4 11-foot driving lanes, variable width shoulder, and variable width sidewalks. And in some locations, we'll talk about the limitations of the sidewalk facilities in the existing conditions. The history of the corridor really kind of dates from its time as part of Route 66. And then since then, the context of the development and business activity along the corridor is what we're dealing with in today's conditions. So some existing traffic conditions. The Cerrillos Road serves high traffic volumes, approaching or exceeding 30,000 vehicles per day. Traffic does fully utilize the available capacity of Cerrillos during peak travel periods. Baca Monterey intersection, that signalized intersection, is the busiest. Delay is experienced at non-signalized stop controls intersections as drivers try and access Cerrillos, and traffic signal system improvements are needed in the corridor. So multimodal facilities, existing shoulders of Cerrillos can be used for bicycle travel, but they're not marked and they're also not signed for bicycle usage. Existing sidewalks are in poor condition, and as Jennifer mentioned, not all are ADA compliant. Segments of the sidewalk are missing, and they're certainly not continuous throughout the project corridor. Pedestrian crossings at signalized intersections are inconsistent. Some are marked, some are not. And Santa Fe Trails bus stops do exist in the corridor. So a little bit about safety conditions.
Terry, it seems we lost you for a minute, though I think you're back.
Okay, sorry about that. I got dropped, but I'm back now.
Great.
2014 to 2018, 494 recorded crashes spread throughout the Cerrillos Road corridor. And that's really indicative of a busy street and driver error by following too closely. And again, sorry for I got dropped for some reason. Apologize for that. In terms of bicycles and pedestrians, there's actually a low occurrence of bicycle crashes, 8 total in 5 years, and a low occurrence of pedestrian crashes, 6 total in those same 5 years. And you can see the graphical representation of the locations on the screen. In terms of existing drainage conditions, there's minimal existing storm drainage infrastructure. There's 3 outfalls of the drainage on Cerrillos: the New Mexico School for the Deaf, Baca Street, and the 4th Street earthen ditch that flows to the Ashbach Park. There's flooding of Cerrillos that occurs during rain events, major and minor. There's no drainage connectivity to adjacent upgraded sections of Cerrillos Road. The adjacent segments of Cerrillos that have been upgraded can accommodate a 10-year storm event. So that's what we'll look to design to connect to. Cerrillos connectivity to the Acequia Madre irrigation system is also an important consideration of the project development. Access to properties, driveways are not controlled. There are conflicts with the existing driveways in terms of pedestrian conflicts, vehicles that are parked backing into Cerrillos Road to gain access back onto Cerrillos, and driveways not permitted by the New Mexico Department of Transportation. There's also encroachments into NMDOT right-of-way, buildings and walls, parking spaces, fences, and utilities, for example, power poles, to name some of the elements. And those will need to be dealt with in the project development process before we can move forward with the improvements. In terms of other infrastructure, existing conditions, the utilities, and P&M has electric power poles. You can see in the picture the presence of some of the power poles. There's gas lines, cable and fiber optic communications. The city of Santa Fe has water and sanitary sewer trunk lines that will look to be improved as part of the project. Lighting, there's lighting along the sidewalks. You can see that in the picture on the P&M power pole. And there's also sporadic lighting in the median. And you can see an example of that in the picture towards the center. And landscaping exists predominantly in the median along Cerrillos within DOT right-of-way. Jennifer, would you like to speak to the environmental existing conditions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Terry. As part of the process, we are identifying the sensitive environmental resources within proximity to the corridor and considering how to design a project that minimizes impacts. Preliminary studies are underway, and thus far we have identified a couple environmental concerns. Within the corridor, we know that we have some noxious weeds and prairie dogs. We have noise receptors and are looking to evaluate whether there will be noise increases. There are visual resources and receptors in the corridor, as well as a number of archaeological and historic resources. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the process the NMDOT follows in developing their projects and making decisions. Currently, we are in the early stages of this project. We're in the study phase. For NMDOT, this is called Phase 1AB. During Phase 1AB, we identify what improvements are needed and why. We review the existing conditions and determine what potential options are available to improve the roadway. As the study progresses, we evaluate the options that may be feasible to carry through to design and eventual construction. We will continue to advance the study after this meeting, and your input is key to helping us come up with one preferred option that we advance into environmental processing and preliminary engineering design. We will answer your questions live at the end of our presentation, which is going to be in about approximately 20 minutes from now. As part of the study phase, the NMDOT considers a wide range of factors in their decision-making. Some of these factors include right-of-way needs, environmental resources, traffic safety, construction feasibility, community concerns, engineering limitations, and available funding. Looking at a range of factors allows the NMDOT to develop a solution that is balanced and meets the project purpose and need. As part of the process, we have been coordinating with agencies and stakeholders that manage resources and lands in and around the corridor. This includes the City of Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Indian School, and the Santa Fe Metropolitan Planning Organization. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Terry to talk a little bit about the preliminary alternatives. Terry?
Thanks again, Jennifer. And I'd like to start in terms of the preliminary alternatives with City of Santa Fe road design guidelines. So as we developed alternatives, we wanted to do our homework and research and see what's out there in terms of guidelines. So the City of Santa Fe new roadway minimum guidelines, and you'll see the 18-foot raised median, 11-foot driving lanes, 5-foot bike lane, 6-foot sidewalk, and a 5-foot sidewalk buffer between back of curbing and sidewalk. All told, that adds up to 98 feet of right-of-way from one side to the other. And if you recall, we have 80 feet existing within Cerrillos to work with. So we're definitely not able to meet all the City of Santa Fe design guidelines for new roadways. I'd like you to remember, if you could, the 11-foot driving lanes, the 5-foot bike lane, and the 6-foot sidewalk as we move forward, because we'll come back and reference those in our alternatives. So some key considerations. I mentioned, again, there's limited right-of-way available along Cerrillos, existing 80-foot wide width of the corridor in terms of DOT right-of-way. Abutting businesses and other properties do join up or adjoin that right-of-way. There's not enough space to widen to 6 lanes, similar to adjacent improvements south of St. Michael's Drive. And there's limited right-of-way available to improve the cross streets that intersect with Cerrillos Road. For example, Baca Street may be able to experience some traffic operational improvements if the side street approaches were improved at the Baca, Monterey, and Cerrillos. But there's developments in all of those quadrants which would not allow us to do that. Some other key considerations with utilities: there's utility conflicts with the sidewalks. There's approximately 55 P&M power poles within or near the right-of-way limits. Pole locations are inconsistent throughout the corridor. We've looked into the cost to bury the power lines with P&M, and it's prohibitive from an operational perspective because there's a very high initial capital cost. There's also a fairly significant cost to property owners for service connections if their facilities were buried, to reconnect the P&M facilities with the businesses. So what we've tried to do so far is to shift the alignment of Cerrillos and reduce widths of certain features like sidewalks where there's poles to accommodate the poles as best we can. And again, there are several buildings at the right-of-way limits. And in fact, there's several buildings that encroach into the right-of-way that are out there today. So how should the roadway be improved? Well, there's the do nothing alternative, which we'll look at and we'll study, but that does not satisfy the purpose and need for this project. So we'll look at maintaining the existing alignment or footprint, if you will, of Cerrillos with some minor shifts in alignment to help deal with some of the constraints. Our efforts really have started with determining the desired roadway typical section for corridor consistency. Site-specific improvements will follow at a future public meeting. So for example, signalized intersection, pedestrian bike crossings, all of those site-specific improvements will follow at a future public meeting. Tonight, we're going to focus on typical sections of the roadway throughout the corridor. So some improvements in terms of guidelines, we're looking at complete roadway reconstruction. We're also looking at reconstruction of underground utilities, water, sanitary sewer, the city of Santa Fe facilities I talked about, the storm drain system, in terms of adding a storm drain system throughout the corridor. Improvement alternatives considered the key corridor constraints. So we looked at differing widths of driving lanes, median, shoulder, and bike lanes. And we've looked at various pedestrian facilities, including sidewalks, shared youth paths, and multi-use trails that would also accommodate bikers or bicyclists. Our initial development that we're going to share with you tonight in screening evaluation consisted of 10 typical sections that we developed for consideration by reaching out to key stakeholders and our partners on the project. So here's a tabulation of our 10 alternatives, and I'll just walk through briefly the summary of what we have here. In terms of the median width, it varied from 12 to 14 feet. We had one alternative that did not have a raised median, so we call that a flush median or a drive over median. Our inside lane width varied from 10.5 to 11 feet. Our outside lane width varied from 10.5 to 11 feet as well. Our bike buffer lane, meaning an area between the roadway and the bike lane or shoulder area, we had two options with a 1.5 and a 3-foot buffer. A bike lane width in our alternatives varied from 4 feet to 5.5. Plus, we also had an 8-foot side path alternative that we looked at. The sidewalk or trail widths varied, if they're off the roadway, varied from 5 feet up to a 12-foot wide multi-use path. We also had some alternatives with some sidewalk or trail buffers, inside or outside buffers. And the right-of-way required varied from the 80 feet, the existing right-of-way or building within the corridor, to 83 to 86. And we had one alternative that required 96 feet of right-of-way. So some traffic and safety improvements. And again, these additional details will emerge in future public meetings, but we'll look to upgrade the existing signal systems. Santa Fe signal at the new Santa Fe Indian School entrance is under consideration. We'll look to deploy or install fiber optic communication lines, including the connectivity of the new signal systems. I mentioned we'll evaluate those stop controlled intersections. Our ability to improve those in terms of a traffic capacity or operational perspective will be limited, as I mentioned. We'll look to perform a traffic signal warrant and access management study at the rail fan intersection. We'll consider pedestrian movements and upgrades to pedestrian accommodations at pedestrian and bicycle crossings and the intersections that I talked about, signalized ones. We'd really appreciate stakeholder and public input on pedestrian bike crossings of Cerrillos in terms of locations of importance and concerns. And we'll look to enhance bus stops. There's a new relocated bus stop at 2nd Street near the Santa Fe Indian School that we'll look at installing. And we'll also look at potentially putting in bus shelters at bus stop locations throughout the corridor. In terms of drainage improvements, I mentioned we'll look to install a new storm drain system throughout the corridor to connect to the previous Cerrillos Road improvements to the south, St. Michael's. We'll look to use the existing outfalls. I mentioned the 3 of them. Will not increase the flows and will strive to actually decrease the flows to the outfalls. We're working with the Aseki Madre Irrigation Ditch Association because of concerns they have with their facilities. The New Mexico DOT is drafting a general office campus master plan to improve the drainage conditions on Cerrillos Road. In fact, 1/3 of the drainage onto Cerrillos Road comes from that area. And that effort was identified as part of this study already by our initial drainage effort. The draft general office campus master plan concept is due soon, and portions of that effort may be incorporated into the project as our project development moves forward. So a comparative evaluation and screening criteria. We started with 4 criteria to evaluate our typical section alternatives. Number 1, balancing multimodal needs, balancing the vehicles, bicyclists, pedestrians throughout the corridor. Secondly, considering building and business operational impacts, an assessment of the impact based on the additional right-of-way needs for each alternative. Accommodating utility facilities, how well the typical section alternative accommodates the existing electric power poles and resolve conflicts with sidewalks and or paths and users. And fourth and finally, how well the alternative provides a smooth riding experience for bicyclists. And what I mean by that is if there's a sidewalk or trail facility behind the curbing, with all the driveways that are there, there could be an undulating or up and down profile of a sidewalk or a multi-use path directly behind the curbing. So here's a matrix of our 10 alternatives that we put together for your consideration and review. And then a couple of things I'd like to point out. Number 1, the first column in terms of balanced multimodal needs, for that criteria, there are no issues without concerns. That's one of the biggest challenges, is balancing all the multimodal needs throughout the corridor. So we have 3 alternatives that are not viable, that have significant flaws. The remainder of them are all viable, but there's concerns no matter which alternative we pick. Secondly, as you start at the top and go down in terms of the alternatives, the first 7 all have issues or significant flaws, which would eliminate them. And most of them have at least 2 of those significant flaws. And then the last one, number 10, also has a significant flaw. So you'll see, looking at 8 and 9, 8 and 9 were the only 2 without any red or non-viable ratings for all 4 of the categories. So those preliminary alternatives not recommended for further consideration, which I talked about. Options 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7 could not provide adequate space to accommodate the power poles and minimize or mitigate those sidewalk impacts. Option 3 could not provide adequate space for roadway shoulders, and it had impacts to multimodal accessibility and would not provide a smooth riding surface for bicyclists. Option 5 could not provide adequate space for roadway shoulders and had impacts to multimodal accessibilities as well. There was also additional right-of-way impacts that would affect businesses. And option 10 had additional right-of-way impacting businesses as well. All this information is on our project website, and we'd encourage you to go look at it on our website, as I mentioned, if you want to study it or do a deeper dive on this information. So the two options to move forward, this one is option 8, recommended for additional analysis by our team. It shows a 12 to 14 foot variable median, 10.5-foot driving lane. So if you think back to the city of Santa Fe standards, 11 was the minimum. So we've reduced the driving lanes to gain some width with this typical section. There's 4 to 5 foot shoulder bike lane facilities, predominantly 5 feet, but 4 feet in areas where we're constrained, like intersections where we have to introduce a left turn lane, and then 5 foot sidewalks on the outside. And if you think back to the city of Santa Fe standards, 6 foot sidewalk was the minimum. This all fits within the existing 40 foot right of way throughout the corridor. Option 9 is very similar to option 8, but it's recommended for additional analysis in areas where right-of-way is possible or we can obtain additional property for our improvements. The main difference on this one is there's additional width in the buffer areas between the bike lane or shoulder and the sidewalks on both sides. And on the left side of the typical section here, you'll see a variable 0 to 8 foot additional either right of way or easement that allows us to expand this typical section width, and again, provide some additional width in the buffer areas. So an initial comparison of the alternatives, as I mentioned, resulted in option 8 and 9 recommended for further detailed study. So at this point in our study, we've actually worked ahead a little bit. We've developed 2 layouts throughout the whole corridor using options 8 and 9. We have a 4 foot bike lane option and a 5 foot bike lane option. And I'd like to show you the 5 foot bike lane option just so you can see what we're talking about, because they're both also on the project website if you'd like to go look at them. So this is our typical section option 8 with 5 foot bike lanes. It's what we call a roll plot of the entire corridor, or a layout. So I just want to show you at this location, in blue is the median and outline of the roadway, the darker blue. In red, with the 3 dots on both sides, is the right-of-way limits, or the DOT right-of-way, that 80-foot width that I've been talking about. And close to that, in lighter blue or turquoise, if you will, is the width or the extents of our typical section. The PP with the number is the power pole location. So we've noted where exactly all the power poles are, those 55 poles that I talked about. And I just like to highlight a couple things on here. If you look to the lower left by 4th Street and Cerrillos, the building there on the lower left quadrant, the red line with 3 dots in it goes right through the building. That means the right of way actually goes through a portion of the building, or saying it another way, the building is encroaching onto existing right of way. The turquoise line is just at the face of the building. So we've actually shifted the alignment of Cerrillos slightly so that our improvements with a 5 foot bike lane will fit just to the front of that building and allow the improvements to be made without having to remove a portion of that building, or potentially allowing that building to remain in place. We've done that at several locations throughout the corridor. Next, I'd like to turn it back to Jennifer.
Thank you, Terry. That's great information. And as a reminder, before I go into the next slide, as a reminder, that information is available on the NMDOT website, which is New Mexico 14 Cerrillos.nmdotprojects.org. Now I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about the schedule and the next steps. The study began in summer 2020 and is anticipated to be completed by February 2022. We are presenting this evening for our first public meeting, and last week we had a business owner meeting. As the study advances, we will have another public meeting in the future, and we encourage you to attend. At the end of the study, we will begin preliminary engineering and environmental study, which is expected spring 2022. We will have another public meeting to help us refine the alternative, and we expect to finalize design by the end of 2020, start of 2023, with construction of the first phase starting as soon as late summer, fall 2023. We anticipate construction will be phased, at least 2 phases, possibly 3. The timing and the phasing of construction will depend upon available funding. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about what those steps will look like. We will be gathering public input from the public today and after our event. For the next 30 days, we will be completing the detailed phase A/B study analysis and preparing the report. We'll be completing the environmental studies and the documentation, as well as developing preliminary design plans and allowing for development of a final design plan. After that, we will identify any right-of-way acquisition needs and prepare the project for construction letting. Well, now that you've heard from us, we would like to hear from you. We're going to be getting ready to go into our question and answer session. But before we do that, I'd like to just give you information on how you can get in contact with us. You are able to send an email. If you have any questions or comments, please send me an email at jennifer.hyre@wsp.com. You may also call me with any questions or concerns you may have. That number is area code 505-878-6577. You can also send any of your comments and questions through the postal mail service. There is also a comment form available on the NMDOT project page, which is nm14cerrillos.nmdotprojects.org. There's also a MetroQuest survey that you can complete as well. Talk about that survey in just a second. We're hoping that you provide us with your questions and comments. At this time, we prefer electronic means as we all are still teleworking. Also, we ask that you provide us with those comments and questions by August 20th in order to allow us to advance with the study. Please, if you would like to be added to our mailing list, let us know. We would like to keep you updated of any future public meetings that we have and other information that we'd like to share. So for this project, we developed a project-specific MetroQuest survey. MetroQuest is a web-based survey tool to gather input on your concerns and priorities along the corridor. This is available at the following website. You can find it on the DOT project website, but it also has its own website, which is rebrand.ly/Cerrillos Road survey. That survey is available in both English and Spanish, and you may choose however is appropriate and convenient for you to answer questions and provide us with your feedback. The survey is compatible with any type of smartphone device, tablet, laptop, or desktop computer. And with that, we would like to get ready to take your questions and answers. If you are joining us through Zoom, you have 2 options. You can raise your hand in the toolbar and you will be able to be brought live to ask your question. The other option, if you are participating through Zoom, is you can, in the Q&A chat box, you can type your question and we will speak it and answer it live. If you are on the telephone, on your telephone keypad, you can press *9 if you have dialed in and would like to ask a question. For those that you can ask questions either in English or Spanish, we have both options this evening. When a question is asked verbally in Spanish, our Spanish interpreter will interpret the question for the project team before it's answered. There may be some pauses as the interpreter moves between those audio channels, so please be patient. We want to answer all of your questions and give everyone the opportunity to speak. And with that, let's take our first question. Our first question comes from one of our members of the public. His question is, given that nearly all motorists live from beyond the corridor, why not share the cost of burying utility lines accordingly? That's a great question. Thank you very much. John, would you be able to help us answer that question?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for that question. If I understand it correctly, is why can't we have the motorists pay for that improvement? I don't know of a mechanism to do that, with the exception of making this like a toll road or something like that, which, you know, we don't do in New Mexico and we wouldn't do especially in an urban setting like this. So I really don't think there is an effective mechanism that would allow us to charge the traveling public for portions of this project other than the existing tax base that is used to fund it.
Great, thank you, John. Very helpful. Another question that we have from one of our members of the public online, she asks, why is it so cost prohibitive to bury electric infrastructure when you are excavating anyway? It's a really good question. John, could you speak to that?
Yes, I'll speak a little bit and then I'll turn it over to Terry to elaborate on that for me. It's not just the cost of digging. We are digging in the project in different locations for different purposes. So this would require not only additional digging, but the required infrastructure that needs to be placed in those trenches for the utilities themselves. Also, to get those utilities out of the ground and to a service for the adjoining property owners, that is an additional cost as well, and could be an additional cost for the adjoining property owners. But Terry, if you could please elaborate on that and maybe correct anything that I may have misspoke on.
Sure, thanks, John. No, good answer. And to add to that, the cost for burying the P&M power lines would be a P&M cost, except for, like I mentioned, the connections from their new buried facility to the businesses or the buildings. So P&M, in terms of a buried facility, it costs anywhere from 3 to 4 times what it would for the overhead. It also takes significantly longer in terms of their internal approvals to do that. And again, they have requirements on property owners in terms of some engineering for those service connections that needs to be paid for, and part of that process and agreements that would need to be worked out. And then again, payment for those connections from the business or property to the main line. So it seems like, you know, kind of a nice solution to the corridor to bury them, but it's very complicated, very complex, and there's a lot of pieces to that effort. So it's not off the table, but it's not highly likely as in our initial discussions.
Great, thank you, Terry. That's very helpful. I see that we have a member of the public who has raised their hand. Mr. Steve Boyles, I believe, is on the line. Brittany, are you able to bring him on to answer his question?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
In the old roadway, there are several left turn breaks in the median, but they're quite small and they seem to actually create accidents. Does the new plan address these?
Good question. Thank you, Steve. John, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Steve, for that question. That is definitely, it's a true observation. The way the median brakes are currently made do make it difficult to make left turns. I think a lot of the difficulties have to do with the lack of a left turn deceleration lane where you can pull out of the traffic to get into that median. So we are looking to make modifications to access, adjusting what access brakes we provide. And when we do provide them, we will be providing a left turn base so you can pull out of traffic and slow down before you negotiate your turn. One thing that's important in helping us accommodate that improvement is the relocation of a lot of the streetlights that are currently in the median. That I believe is why it's somewhat prohibitive to do it in that ideal situation is currently is because of all those streetlights. So we are looking to move those streetlights to the edges of the roadway along the sidewalk. So that way it frees up our median and allows us to better accommodate left turn movements.
Thank you, John. That's very helpful. We have another member of the public who has raised their hand to speak. We have Hubert Van Heck on the phone. Hubert, do you have your question ready?
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hello,
Yes.
welcome.
Hi, this has to do with the bicycle amenities. The current situation where the bicycle path is separated from the fast-moving traffic by just a white line is just not an acceptable solution. I would not call that an acceptable bicycle solution. I believe that options 3 and 5 were eliminated because of the requirement to have a shoulder. Now, if the bike lane functions as a shoulder and a vehicle, I don't know what the function of the shoulder is, but if a vehicle is in trouble, pulls over into a 4 or 5 foot bike lane, it will block the right-hand lane anyway. I think a shoulder is the first thing that should be abandoned in favor of having the bicycle path up on a curb and separated from the fast-moving traffic. Just a painted line and sharing the asphalt, I believe, is not a solution that anybody in the biking community would be happy with. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Hubert. John, would you be able to speak to that a little more?
Yes, thank you for that that question, Mr. Hubert. We are still looking at possible ways to accommodate the bicycle lane. One of the reasons we are preferring to place it as proposed is that proposal most closely matches the current city guidelines. In addition, things that we would have to consider if we were to make a separate bike path is the fact that there are so many driveways on this road. I think that can make it difficult to make a separate path that almost acts as a trail. That almost makes it somewhat prohibitive just because of all the turning movements and the fact that it's pulling the path away from traffic and from their point of view to where they can see bicycles and negotiate turns around them. So those are some reasons that we haven't strongly looked at that. Others is right of way. It's still going to require additional right of way to accommodate that in that area. Other things we need to consider as well are some of our drainage conditions. We need to be able to accommodate a certain amount of drainage on our roadways, and the shoulders help with that. If we do not have a shoulder, then all the drainage, especially during heavy rain events, will be in that travel lane. So those shoulders help to provide refuge for our drainage so that it doesn't significantly impede traffic. If I can, I'd also like to ask Terry to if there's anything that he would like to add or elaborate on with regards to that question.
Yeah, thanks, John. Brittany, could you pull up option 3? I think they're available here, and I'd just like to look at 3 and look at 5. So option 3, here's an 8-foot multi-use trail on both sides, and it It fits within the 80-foot right of way. There's no roadway shoulders. The issue with that is the 8-foot multi-use trails are really only for short sections of where there's obstructions. It's not really meant to be a consistent corridor-wide solution in terms of an 8-foot trail. It really doesn't follow the guidance, if you will, for multi-use trail usage. If you go to number 5, option 5, which was also brought up, this one has a 12-foot multi-use trail, both sides, but you'll see we need 8 feet of right-of-way on both sides to accommodate that 12-foot multi-use trail. And if you think back to the layout that we showed you in that one building, there's multiple buildings or businesses along the corridor where any right-of-way would have what we think is significant impacts to the building or the business operations. So that was some of our assessment of those two alternatives, but really good question, and thank you for.
Thank you, Terry and John. Appreciate it. We have a question from one of our folks in the chat. Hannah's question is, how we work on the parking problem? Backing into Cerrillos seems like a dangerous maneuver. Why does NMDOT encourage/allow this? It's a great question, Hannah. Thank you. John, can you help us answer that question?
Yes, thank you, Hannah, for that question. Yes, that situation does exist in quite a few areas, and really the reason it's been allowed is just because of the age of the roadway. This corridor has been around for quite some time, and I think a lot of these businesses have been as well. So it's almost a pre-existing situation. We are going to be working with the property owners to see if there are opportunities to remedy some of these issues, but we will be trying to balance that with any impacts to those businesses. So we will continue to look at that and try to develop solutions as we work through the design of this project.
Thank you, John. We have another question. We have a question from Tom. Tom's question is, are owners of buildings that encroach on the right-of-way being fined or otherwise paying for their violation? How many are there? That's a really good question, John, or Tom. I will let John answer that question for you.
Yes, Tom, I don't know exactly how many of those encroachments we have. I could ask Terry to see if he has the number, but yes, we will be looking to resolve those encroachments. And it would be through some form of license agreement with those property owners. And so we will try to remedy those encroachments and make sure that they are no longer unaccounted for encroachments and they're accounted for properly. Did you have a number, Terry, of encroachments that we may have, or are we still early on in the design to nail that number down?
Yeah, a couple of things I can say, John. There's 2 buildings that we're aware of that encroach onto DOT right away. There's the fence at the Fairview Cemetery, the fence at the New Mexico School for the Deaf, part of that. There's several parking locations. Business by Baca Street, that signalized intersection has an overhang that goes onto DOT right away. So if you'd like anyone, we actually have posted property ownership maps that have on the encroachments that we're aware of on the property ownership maps on the project website. So you can actually go look at them if you'd like to. Thanks, John.
Great, thank you for that. Another question we have comes from Christine. Her question is, the street lighting seems to be inconsistent throughout the project. Will the street lighting be improved or is this cost prohibitive? Good question, thank you, Christine. John, can you speak to the lighting improvements?
Yes, thank you, Christine, for that question. It's an important question, and that is one of our goals in this project is to improve the lighting and to make it consistent. So we are definitely looking to make improvements on our lighting with this project.
Great, thank you, John. We have another question. We have another question from one of our listeners. We have a question from Ralph. Ralph's question is, what entities are considered stakeholders? It's a good question, Ralph. John, I will take this one if you want me to, or would you like to talk about stakeholders?
Please do so, Jennifer.
Okay, so stakeholders are defined a little bit differently than the public. Those that are stakeholders are considered to be groups and organizations that have a stake or interest in the project. Stakeholders typically include schools, the city, counties, neighborhood associations, business owners, that they are those non-public entities that are organized, that are interested in the project, and that might have different concerns or input than the general traveling public. So thank you for that question. Another question we have comes from Sydney. Sydney's question is, when and how do we find out what option has been chosen? It's a good question, Sydney. John, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, thank you for that question. What we're doing now is we have a slew of alternatives that we've been looking at as part of Phase AB. We're going to try at the end of Phase AB to come up with a preferred alternative. At that point, we'll move forward with that design. If I can ask Terry or Jennifer, did we have a estimated date for when that would be accomplished?
That is a good question. We're going to be advancing the environmental study in spring of 2022, and we are actually going to have another public meeting after this one before we do advance into our preliminary engineering. So as John was mentioning, right now we've been looking at a suite of preliminary options, and part of that study process is that through this next step of more detailed analysis on some of those options that are potentially viable, we work through this in a detailed way in order to get to a single alternative that is recommended, that then that's preferred, that becomes advanced. At that point where we're getting to where we have looked at these options in more detail and are getting closer to that preferred and recommended alternative, that's when we will be having another public meeting where we come back to the public to talk about that process, talk about how we have refined some of what we've initially talked with you this evening about. So that will be happening in the future. We don't have a date set quite yet. We're anticipating that we're completing the study around February 2022. So you can probably expect that towards the end of the year, going into next year, we're going to be coming back to you to have another public meeting to discuss this and discuss some of those more refined details that we've looked at. So thank you for your question on that. That's a really good question. And so there will also be more opportunities for public meetings and input, and we're glad that you are here with us. Another question, let's see, do we have anyone with their hand raised, Brittany?
We do. Mr. Alan Burris has his hand raised.
Alan, welcome. What is your question?
Alan, you may need to unmute on your end. You'll see a pop-up box.
Yeah, there we go. Unmute.
Yes, hello.
Hey there. Typically, you've heard from me about a whole other issue, but this came up in just your presentation, which was something that it seemed a little strange maybe, but on those graphs and all that had all the different 10 alternatives, one of them, and I'm not sure if it was the final one or not, because now it's not there, and trying to look at all those quickly was a little bit tricky. But, and people are talking about, should things be a little wider or a little narrower, and how that all works. And I noticed that I think on that final one that the lane was going to be like 10.5 feet to 11 feet or something. And but what I also noticed was that for some reason the median stayed like, it seemed to me, a high number, like 12 to 14 feet. And that didn't seem to get taken away from for any of these other variations that might be needed. And if a lane is 10.5 to 11, 12 to 14, that's way bigger than even a lane for turning. What's that about? Because I know even on the existing medians, there's a lot of places where I think I'm just trying to remember this off the top, but they're only like about 6 feet wide even now, and maybe they go bigger and smaller and different things. So that just seems strange that median thing, nothing ever seemed to come off of it in terms of relative to what's been cut left and right and different sides. Any comment on that?
Thank you, Alan. John, would you be able to speak to the median widths?
Yes, thank you for that question. So yes, it does seem, I can definitely understand how it appears that way. The median that we are proposing is less than what the city requirement is. So we did bring down that median width. The reason it's not the 10.5 feet is because in the areas that we provide the turn lane, the turn lane may be 10.5 feet or so, but we need to provide enough room on top of that to continue the narrower piece of curb and gutter. An important reason for that narrower piece of curb and gutter, that barrier curb there, is just to help with the access control that we're trying to accomplish through this project. So that 12 feet encompasses not only a turning lane, but it includes back-to-back curb and gutter that helps provide further channelization through that turn lane.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. We have a question from one of our members of the public in the chat box. Her question is, can we put the bike lane directly next to the sidewalk and move the buffer to buffer the bike lane and sidewalk simultaneously? Thank you for that question. John, can you help us answer that?
Yes, I think this is similar to one of the earlier questions regarding a multi-use path on the side. I think putting a bicycle lane and a pedestrian path side by side would just result in one continuous width of hard surface that would basically function as one wide multi-use path. So it really, the answer that we had to the previous question that myself and Terry had, it applies to this question as well. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Terry.
No, John, just that we did look at what's called a side path, similar on Alameda north of St. Francis, I'll call it, in that area. But the context of that setting is more of a park-like setting. They've got a lot more room or property to work with where they put that side path in. We did look at a 8-foot wide multi-use trail as we've shown, which really does not fit in terms of the guidelines and corridor consistency. And then that 12-foot multi-use trail that we've looked at. There's really not guidelines, if you will, for a side-by-side sidewalk / trail facility that we've found. It's more of kind of those combined facilities of side path, multi-use trails. So that's what we've.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. A question that we have from another member of the public. Theodore asks, would it not be a good idea to go up an order of magnitude and consider a 100-year rain flood event in planning for the drainage? Worldwide, events indicate that a 10-year flood event is no longer the usual. Thank you for that, Theodore. John, would you be able to answer his question?
Yes, and again, I'll ask Terry to elaborate after I complete my answer, but thank you for that question. One of the reasons we are looking at a 10-year storm event is that's what previous phases of Cerrillos Road were designed to. And the reason that's important is in those previous phases, we've installed a trunk line storm drain that this will be attaching to. So that in and of itself can only accommodate that. And so that's really why we're designing to that level. It's because the now existing infrastructure that we are tying into, that's what that infrastructure can accommodate.
Yeah, John, and I would just add, it really boils down to balancing investments versus impacts. And so to meet a 100-year storm event in terms of the design, we would need to retain flows and actually put in some fairly significant ponding or retention to do that. So if you look through the corridor and the proximity of the corridor, you have to think about, well, where would those locations be to even try and accomplish that, irregardless of the capital cost to do it. It's a very challenging corridor to look at that higher level of drainage design in terms of those retention facilities.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, John. That's helpful. Another question that well, actually first, let me remind folks, if you are on the phone and would like to ask a question, feel free to on your telephone keypad, press *9 and you can ask your question live. If you are joining us through Zoom and would like to ask your question live, use the raise your hand function, or you can use the Q&A chat box to type your questions and then we will read them. And if you have any questions on the Spanish channel, we will be able to have the interpreter come in to ask those questions as well. Another question that we have from a member of the public is, how will intersections be improved? Thank you for that question. To clarify, the intersections of St. Michael's and St. Francis are not part of the improvements of the Cerrillos Road corridor project that we're doing. But I will let John speak to how some of the other intersections along the corridor might be improved and what we're looking at in that regard. John?
Thank you. So we will be looking at improving all our major existing signalized intersections to replace the signals, replace the detection, and look for opportunities to improve some of the turn lanes in those areas. I think Terry mentioned that we will be looking at potentially a new signal at the new Santa Fe Indian School entrance. We have done a cursory, we have done a warrant analysis for that, and it has met warrants. So we will be looking to include that in this project. We will be doing a warrant analysis at Railfan to see if any signalized improvements are justified at that intersection. With regards to every driveway along this road, as well as street entrance, those all basically constitute an intersection. And we will be reconstructing all the driveways and all the intersections, making them all ADA compliant. And we will be making improvements to those, I think, through the virtue of trying to accommodate access control where needed. We will be adding turn bays, similar to one of the earlier questions about why the median openings are currently situated the way they are. We're going to look to improve those by adding turn bays, which will help to improve turning function at those specific intersections. But those are our basic ways that we will be looking at improving intersections. I don't know, do you have anything to add to that, Terry?
Just that one of the significant challenges at the signalized intersections will be the curb ramps and the quadrants to meet ADA compliance. So we'll have to carefully engineer the ADA compliant ped ramps at all the intersection quadrants, and that that may or may not require some right of way, providing updated markings and crosswalks and all those features and elements.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. Another question we have comes from Barbara. Barbara's question is, have you studied traffic impacts on nearby neighborhoods from improvements proposed, i.e. have you completed traffic studies on adjacent streets? That's a good question, Barbara. Thank you. John, can you help us answer that question?
Yes, thank you for that question. So we are not doing traffic analysis on adjacent streets as part of this project. As far as the reason for that is we have virtually no opportunity to add capacity to be able to add traffic flow on this segment. Really, the only way to do that would be to add additional lanes, which because of right-of-way constraints, we would not be able to do. That being said, I think with access control and improved signal timing that we will look to do as part of this project, we're hoping to get better traffic flow on Cerrillos. And with that, we would hope that that would make Cerrillos a more attractive route for people that are trying to commute through the city and pull them off of surrounding roadway networks where they may be currently cutting through. On previous phases of Cerrillos Road, the improvements that we've done, it's hard to attribute it definitively to that, but we have noticed just through permanent counters that have been placed on certain streets in the city, that streets that would make sense that people would be using to avoid Cerrillos Road, such as Agua Fria, volumes have decreased on that road, on those roads. So I think there are certain reasons for that could help them help that situation where volumes are being reduced. But I do think improvements on Cerrillos Road will definitely help, have helped and will continue to help reducing neighborhood traffic.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. That's really helpful. Another question that we have comes from Lynn. Lynn's question is, why are the medians proposed at 12 to 14 feet? Is that to accommodate turning traffic? It's a good question, Lynn. John, could you help us answer that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's exactly what it's for. It's to accommodate turning traffic, and that entire width, as I explained on a previous question, is for the turn bay as well as for the back-to-back curb channelization that goes along those turn lanes. Also, through portions of the road where there is not turn lanes, we will be placing landscaping. So in addition to providing an aesthetic amenity to the corridor itself, landscaping does have a traffic calming effect. It's a visual cue that helps to reduce speeds and control speeds. So we will be using medians for that as well.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Brittany, do we have anyone who has raised their hand?
We do not currently have anybody with their hand up.
Okay, perfect. Then we'll go to one of our questions in the chat box. One of those questions comes from William. William's question is, why are bike lanes being included? I'm a bicyclist, but would not ride on Cerrillos Road. It is very dangerous. John, would you be able to speak to why we're including bicycle lanes?
Yes, thank you for that question. One reason is we're trying to comply with the city's guidelines as best as possible, and those do include bike lanes along the facility. We do understand that some people are uncomfortable to travel on bike lanes on busy roads such as this. So it's just an alternative for people that do feel comfortable using these lanes. But there are other facilities through the city that hopefully, if you're trying to commute from one side to the other, that there are other options that you can utilize. The Santa Fe Metropolitan Planning Organization has a very useful map of all the existing facilities we have, as well as future planned facilities. I believe they still even have a map that kind of rates how challenging a facility is. It's almost like a ski map, if you will, from green to black diamond. It may not be colored that way, but it does have that. So it does help to help bicyclists plan their commute around the city based on their comfort level for roadways.
That's great information. I didn't know that. Another question we have from one of our online listeners. She asks, are you considering access control and driveway sharing to decrease conflicts between different user types? It's a good question. John, would you like to answer that question for us?
Yes. Thank you again for that question. Yeah, definitely we are looking at access control. We may look at sharing of driveways. The difficulty with that is when there are separate properties, if they're are not the established easements on those properties to accommodate shared driveways, it's difficult for us to incorporate in the project. But where possible, definitely those type of improvements can improve safety as well as traffic flow. So we will be looking to do that where reasonable. We will be working with property owners and business owners while doing that to make sure we don't have any adverse impacts to them, but we will be looking at that through the design of the project.
Thank you, John. That's helpful. It appears we have Tom Kondo who has raised his hand. Tom, are you with us live?
Yes, I am. Yes,
Hello,
I'm here.
what is your question?
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is just to make sure that people are aware that if you're going southbound on Cerrillos and make a left turn at 5th Street, there's an inadequate turn lane and there's not much room to build a greater one because you've got the fire department and everything there. So I want to make sure there's some focus on it. It is the place where things back up the most from people just trying to make a left turn, and it's a problem. The question I have is, it looks like if there's a business that people are, the project is trying to make sure that nothing impacts any of the businesses, but they're willing to impact the motorists that are using the road, you know, narrowing the lane and so forth. A consideration would be, I've driven on many roads in which the center turn lane or a left turn lane does not have a concrete shoulder on it, and it's just a white line and it's the width of a single lane. You know, was that considered? And if it was, why wouldn't you use that and narrow the center median?
That's a good question, Tom. Thank you. John, can you answer Tom's question for us?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kondo, for that question. We did consider that. The reality is those type of lanes, it's called a two-way left turn lane. We really try to avoid those wherever possible. The reason is there are a lot of safety concerns with two-way left turn lanes. A lot of crashes happen because people can virtually turn at any location. So you have conflicting traffic trying to turn in opposite directions, as well as people trying to enter the roadway, all in numerous locations, in an infinite amount of locations, I guess, if you will, throughout the corridor. There have been studies that show that, in fact, on Airport Road, there was a portion of Airport Road that was exactly that. It was just a striped median, a two-way left turn lane. And there were a lot of crashes because of it. And the city then did a median project where we did access control. We did limit access to businesses. It accommodated their business, but we did have to limit access to them by putting up this median. And what that in turn did is it reduced crashes by a significant amount. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I think total crashes went down by over 50%. And I think injury and fatality crashes were like in the 70 percentile. So we did do at the city where I used to work a before and after analysis, and it showed beyond a reasonable doubt that having access control and order along a busy road such as this significantly reduces crashes. So for that reason, we did not choose to pursue a two-way left turn lane.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. An anonymous question that we have from one of our public members in the chat box Their question is, you answered the question about why not combine the bike lane and sidewalk and put the buffer between the bike lane and the traffic lane by saying that it would create too big of a bike lane / sidewalk. But why could you not put a small curb in between the bike lane and sidewalk, say 6 inches wide and 6 inches tall? John, could you speak to and help us answer that question?
Yes, so definitely thank you for that suggestion. If I can, Terry, would you be able to answer that question and explain challenges with doing a setup as suggested?
Yeah, thanks, John. Brittany, could we go to typical section option 8, if you could? Just to kind of show, so here's where we landed in terms of building within existing right of way. And it shows a 5-foot sidewalk on each side. And again, City of Santa Fe sidewalk standards would ask for a 6-foot minimum sidewalk, but we're at 5. So if we're going to add a curbing here, and even if it's say 6 inches, and then a separated bike trail facility, you're adding width on each side to do that. And again, with the constrained corridor, if you think back to the layout that we showed you, it's going to have some significant impacts to buildings and businesses throughout the corridor. So that's why, unless you start to look at removing the bike lane shoulder off of the roadway, which has other operational issues or concerns with that. I hope that helps address or answer the question.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. Another question that we have in our chat is, are the medians planned to serve as pedestrian islands in key spots as well? Will key locations then allow for ADA access, and will the number of safe pedestrian crossings be increased? It's a really good question. Thank you for that. John, could you help us answer that question?
Yes, thank you for that question. And you know, in areas where mid-block crossings are provided, a median refuge does improve those. But on roads such as Cerrillos, especially in this location with the amount of volume and the amount of lanes, we are looking to avoid unsignalized pedestrian crossings. One of the main reasons for that is safety. Unless there is a really strong flow, consistent flow of traffic at these locations, what ends up happening of pedestrian traffic, you end up having what's called a dual threat conflict. And what that is you have 2 lanes going in one direction. You're on the curb line. The first lane stops, say it's a semi, say it's a moving truck. They stop to let you through. The inside lane they don't know why they're stopped. They don't see you coming in front of that car. So when you get into the inside lane, that person hits you because they continue to go. So for those reasons, we do not like to put mid-block crossings on major roads like this. If it was a single lane in each direction road and there was a need for it, then definitely, yes, we would look to utilize the median as a median refuge to help make that a 2-step crossing. But in this situation, we would not recommend to do that for safety reasons.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. We have a question from William. William's question is, how will you separate cars from bicycles? It's a good question. Thank you, William. John, can you help us answer that?
Yes, thank you for that question. Right now, we're looking to do it with the stripe. This is typical throughout the majority of the city. Both the bicyclists and the vehicles will have to follow current laws regarding their movements, the Uniform Traffic Code that's been adopted by the city. And so they will have to follow their respective rules while negotiating each other in their respective areas.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Let's see, Paul Brasher, District Engineer Paul Brasher, are you on the phone? Do you want to say a couple words for our audience this evening? Or Javier?
This is Paul Brasher. I'm the, thank you, Jennifer. I'm the District 5 engineer for the New Mexico Department of Transportation. What I would like to say is, and tell those that are listening that and participating that we appreciate their presence here. I want to thank the Commissioner and the City Councilor for being with us today, and my colleagues from the Department of Transportation, the city, and Metropolitan Planning Organization for Santa Fe. You know, this district, the highways are managed throughout the state out of 6 districts. This is District 5, and our district includes San Juan County, Rio Arriba County, Taos County, Santa Fe County, Los Alamos County, and Torrance County. And I think that I can speak for, I know I can speak for the Department of Transportation. I think I can speak for the City of Santa Fe and the Metropolitan Planning Organization when I say that everything that we do places emphasis on safety, mobility, economy, and environmental stewardship. And so what we've done is, together with the City of Santa Fe, we've brought together this team of experienced, dedicated professionals with great experience and education and background to take on this project. Now, what you heard tonight is that we're going to address some current needs for ADA, sidewalk, bicycles, access, asphalt, the condition of asphalt, drainage, and other things. But beyond the immediate needs for these remedies, I'll tell you what we all have not lost sight of. And John, my colleague, John Romero, touched on this very briefly a few minutes ago in one of his responses about backing out into the road. And what he said was that this road was built. This road has a lot of miles on it. This road has been around for a long, long time. So we have all sort of inherited. We've all inherited the conditions that we have today. Buildings that might encroach into the right of way, power poles that are blocking the sidewalk, inhibiting ADA, and all built at a time when there was no American with Disabilities Act, and before bicycles were considered a substantial mode of transportation. So we all have, and right-of-way width. So we have all these constraints we're trying to work within. And so we talked today about fixing some immediate needs, but I will assure you, and I'll just close with this thought, that none of us has lost sight of the fact that we've inherited this road. We've inherited these conditions. And what we do tonight, and in this project is of historical significance. Because if it's taken decades to get to this point, it is probably going to be decades before this road is ever looked at again in the future. So we recognize that what we're doing is not just good for today, but we expect this to serve well into the future so that we can all look back on it, and our ancestors, or rather our future generations, can look back on it with the satisfaction that we did the right thing, because we're taking this into the future for everybody to use and enjoy and make the most of. So with that, I want to thank everybody for participating, and thank again, my colleagues with the governmental entities, with DOT, the city, and MPO, and our consultant staff. I'd like to thank our commissioners and the city councilors for backing this project and being so supportive, and the public for being so cooperative in contributing comments and with their forthcoming patience as we get under construction. So in 12 words or less, I'll close with that, Jennifer. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. We do have a couple questions that came in. We had a question come in from Barbara. Her question is, are you considering preventing left turns out of Railfan and the NMDOT property? Also, are you considering reducing the NMDOT side to allow a sidewalk along the Oddfellows and Fairview cemeteries? It's a good question, Barbara. Thank you. John, can you help us answer that question?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Fix, for that question. So we have not dove into specific geometric design for intersections. That'll be handled during phase 2 of our design. So we will be looking at that intersection. Right now, we haven't decided what kind of treatment we're going to be providing there. With regards to sidewalk, we will be providing continuous sidewalk on both sides of the road throughout the entire stretch of this segment of roadway.
Thank you. Appreciate it, John. We have one more question from an anonymous public member. Their follow-up comment is, I did not understand the answer. Option 8 has 2 feet of curb shoulder between the bike lane and then another 2 feet between the curb and the sidewalk. Why can't you move the curb/shoulder to the driving lane side of the bike lane and then lessen the 2 feet between the bike lane and the sidewalk with a smaller curb? That would seem to protect the bikes from the cars and also separate the bikes from the pedestrians, as well as give more room. This might be a complicated of enough question and comment because of we might need to answer this and follow up with you offline possibly. But let me see if John or Terry can help us answer this question regarding option 8.
Yes, I agree that this would probably be best addressed after, so we could take a look at it and make a proper analysis of what you are suggesting. But Terry, I don't know if you have any comments.
Just real quick, Brittany, would you pull up option 8? I just want to make a couple of comments and then we can address it later on. But just real quick on option 8, the first 2 foot on the right hand side, it's on both sides, is actually the curbing, and then the second 2 foot on the right hand side is a buffer area which helps with the utility poles. So I just wanted to describe what those were, but we really like to take another look at this. Make sure we get your name and your contact information so that we can get back to you in terms of a more definitive.
Yes, please, if you would reach out to me so that we can definitely help answer that question for you. This is great feedback and we definitely want to explain the thought process, explain what we've done. To be able to reach me, there are a couple different ways. You can email me at jennifer.hyre@wsp.com. You can call me at area code 505-878-6577. If it is easier for you to send us something through the post mail, that is okay as well. That can come to our office address. Or you can also use the electronic comment form that is at the NMDOT project page for this project, which is nm14cerrillos.nmdotprojects.org. I want to remind all of you that we have a MetroQuest survey that we've developed specifically for this project that allows you to go in, be interactive, give us your input on those priorities, those trade-offs, explain your concerns to us. There's a map where you can drop pins and give us comments in specific detailed areas. We would really love it if you would go in and try using that and giving us some feedback there. That can be found at rebrand.ly/Cerrillos Road survey. There's also a way to get to it through the NMDOT projects page. So there's 2 different ways. We've offered that in both English and Spanish for your convenience. Looks like we have one more question. We have a question from Justin. Justin's question is, are you taking into consideration the previous plan for a traffic light at Railfan to accommodate the heavy traffic coming in and out of the Baco rail yard? It's a good question, Justin. Thank you. John, would you be able to answer that question for us?
Yes, thank you, Justin, for that question. We will be doing a signal warrant analysis at that intersection and determine if a signal is justified at that intersection. So that analysis will be included in our design.
Thank you, John. That's helpful. Is there anything that you would want to add, Terry?
No, just that at real fan the signal warrant analysis, there's criteria for putting signals in. And then also we'll look at access management along there too. Even if it meets signal warrants, it has to meet kind of access and operational criteria as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful. Hopefully that answers your question, but after tonight, there's still opportunities, and we encourage you to send your questions, send your input, and we will address those and make sure that you are heard. We are glad that you joined us this evening. Your feedback is very important to helping us advance this project. We wish we could have been with you this evening face to face, but we're glad that you could join us this evening. You're helping us advance the project, and we will be coming back to you in the future. There will be more opportunities to hear from us and to participate and give us your feedback and questions. So we want to thank everyone that has joined us and stayed on for as long as you have. I hope you have a fantastic evening, and please stay safe.